Will you throw something on the floor where you shouldn't? Those are all social dilemmas. Now, the people who form collectivities like this, they decide to basically constantly create social dilemmas, but they also decide to solve them. And solving dilemmas of this kind can be done by setting up institutions that regulate access and management to the group, but also the use and monitoring of the use of the resources we have collectively. With institutions, we mean norms, values, but definitely also rules that our people are bringing up to make sure that this can be done in a social equitable way, so people respect each other, and an efficient resource use, and true self-governance. So this is a bit the abstract model of, you could say, a common. In the literature, the term common has been used in many different ways, and that's why at some point I decided to stop using the term common when I'm talking about the more generic form of types of self-governance today. But I'm talking about institutions for collective action, which is a term, I'll come back to that in a second, developed by Alan Ostrom as well. Now, an institution for collective action is a governance regime, so it's a way of governing resources, but also people. A governance regime or natural or man-made resources that are shared and managed by a group of users according to collectively set agreements. So people decide on how, as a group, they will use their resources. There's three mechanisms that lead to the resilience of such organizations. A lot of the discussion that was started with the tragedy of the commons in the 1960s by Garrett Hardin was the claim that such organizations that run on these principles, that they cannot be resilient, that they will fall apart, that these people will fight for the resources, they will over-commercialize. Well, we know on the basis of the work of Alan Ostrom and others that this is not true, that these organizations can be resilient, but you have to take into account a few things, and you have to set up a good functioning institution. Now, there's a number of things that play a very important role in making sure that such an institution can be resilient and keep going for a very long time. It has to start with reciprocity. People bring something in order to receive something. So when people become part of an energy cooperative, they have to contribute in order to receive energy from the cooperative. At the same time, they also have to show solidarity. So when you're part of a mutual insurance organization, as the one I explained in the beginning, you have to agree that other people might need budget from the insurance company before you can actually use it. And at the same time, sufficiency is also an important value here. It means that you use the resources to the extent that you need them. And it also means that you don't over commercialize the goods that you have collectively, because that puts a lot of pressure on the organization. There's a method we've developed to study this. We call it the Cicada method, the strategies of institutions for collective action and development, and this builds on this model. But the term itself, institution for collective action, goes back to the work of Alan Ostrom, that many of you will probably know as a Nobel Prize winner 2009. And she was basically the first who brought together a lot of evidence showing that the commons can be governed in a resilient, sustainable way. And she also was the first to actually picture the specific features of such organizations like exclusiveness, bottom-up formation, self-governance, etc. I promised you to take you back into history, and quite a long way into history. And that's where our journey is going to from now on, in order to make sure that I can tell you a bit more about how these commons have developed over time. So as I said, we have a new growth of various forms of institutions for collective action these days, from energy cooperatives, care cooperatives, but all sorts of housing, co-housing initiatives, mutuals, worker cooperatives. In some countries, more of one, in other countries, more of the other. In some countries, the organizations are still small, in others, they have evolved already. The question that I would like to discuss with you today, the overarching question is this a sort of new start of a new era of institutions for collective action? this is a new wave of institutions for collective action. And it actually might be, although even though it fills quite a bit of a screen, it's still quite marginal in our history. I mean, in what we've seen today and in comparison to what we've seen in history in the past. The previous period when we've seen a growth of such institutions was what you could call the second wave of institutions for collective action. That was around 1880 till 1920. We saw rapid growth of consumer cooperatives, banking cooperatives, credit unions, labor unions, but also mutual insurances. So producer cooperatives, we've seen them, and I think that many of you, yes, many of you know examples in your neighborhood of cooperative banks or cooperative supermarkets that still exist. This could have been the second wave of institutional collective action, but before that, we already see from the late medieval period onwards a rapid growth in this type of institution. The one that springs that you will be most familiar with in name, at least, is the common, but that's only the agricultural common that we're referring to here, the one. There's also other types like guilds, which were more the urban forms of institutions for collective action, and some other ones like journeyman's boxes. I'm pretty sure that fairly no one in the audience probably knows about these journeyman's boxes. They were not a huge phenomenon, but they were mutual insurance groups set up by the journeymen, the people who were helping out the guild masters, and they split up as separate organizations in the 16th century. But during this period, the early modern period, until about 1800, this type of organization was actually very dominant in economic life across Europe. In most European countries, we see that these forms of management of resources were picking up very quickly and were dominating the economic exchange. Guilds were very central in, for example, the exchange on markets and how the economy was run, basically. But by the end of the 18th century, this period, and the early 19th century, we see that all across Europe, governments are very hostile towards this type of collective organization. It's a time of the Enlightenment, but it's also the time of the formation of the nation states in Europe. So it's a time when there's another belief, a bigger belief in the potential of individual citizens to thrive and to drive the economy. And that really changes the way the economy is organized. And also how this affects the political situation. And so in between, let's say 1780, 1840, that's a period when a lot of these collectives are attacked by nation states and are dissolved top down across Europe. Now, if we look at these organizations in a more taxonomic way, if you want, if we compare them on the basis of, for example, their role as members, we see that over time, that there's a sort of three groups. So there's producers and employees who unite themselves in these organizations. There's a very important role for consumers as organizers of such collectives, of such commons. And there's also, and that's also very present today, a group on the basis of citizenship, simply of being part of a community. People also form these cooperatives. Now, what I would like to do with you is have a very quick look, because I don't have that much time. Yes, I can't use the animation. At a number of consumer-driven collectives in the past and the present, so that you can see how we compare these over time. The agro-commons here, the consumer cooperatives, and the energy cooperatives. Just to give you some example of what they look like in the past. This is a Dutch agricultural common that started in the middle of the 16th century, but went on until, well, the middle of the 19th century, more or less, when in the Netherlands, most commons were dissolved and they were split up, were privatized under pressure of the national government. What we see here is a pasture run by a group of citizens on the basis of democratic principles. So members had to be part of the decision-making process. We might find that weird, but in those days when people were not taking part, they were being fined for that. If you did not go to a meeting, they were getting a fine. And this is the case also here, because if you were not there and you did not know why the rules changed, it was not good for the organization. So you were made responsible for the decision-making process. Not being part of it is not good. These days, when we don't go to the meeting of an energy cooperative, we will not get a fine. But in a way, it would be much better if everybody is forced to go there so that you are part of the decision-making process. There's a lot of other features that that we can find in these organizations. For example, also the solidarity that goes beyond the institution. In most of these organizations, we see that they have some sort of charity reflex, if you want. And most commons, they were primarily for members, quite exclusively for members, but they also had arrangements for widows, for people, poor people, to also join to also use the resources, but not as a member. So there's some sort of exclusivity there. If we then go to another example, that of the Cooperative Association, also in the Netherlands, we've taken 3 Dutch examples here. It's a retail cooperative. As I said, in the second half of the 19th century, we see a real surge of cooperatives, definitely also of retail/consumer cooperatives. The first cooperatives were emerging in the 1840s in the UK and also in Germany, but a bit later in the Netherlands they also emerged there. You see that they invest primarily in consumption goods at a low price. So they try, by creating a sort of critical mass in the resources they bring, to make it more interesting for their members. Now, the picture you see there is basically a sort of proto-supermarket, if you want. And interesting to know probably is that the supermarket, although we associate that with a very capitalist form of consumption these days, it does go back to the first cooperatives, which were able to offer a lot of different services. And cooperatives have a capacity to offer a wide array of services and goods because they have members. And the more types of goods they offer to members, the more interesting it becomes for the organization. So typically for the cooperative, it is a multi-purpose organization offering different types of goods. And well, that was possible through a sort of prototype of supermarket. Now let's go to another example to speed it up a little bit. That's more contemporary, also a form of consumer cooperative in the Netherlands, in between Utrecht and Rotterdam, Gouda. They don't just have cheese over there, but also solar panels. An energy cooperative that was set up about 10 years ago and is still running today. They too have democratic principles they build on, and one man, one vote. It is not a demand in Dutch legislation that cooperatives only give one vote to each person, but many cooperatives do adopt that principle. So every member also has to add the resources to the collectivity. They have to be open about the communication about the cooperative, and they They also try to promote knowledge sharing within this group. These are 3 forms of consumer cooperatives. They don't offer the same goods over time and history, but they are very similar in the way they are set up. Now, there's similarities, as I just showed, but there's also differences across these 3 waves of institutions for collective action. They basically react and more or less to the same stimulus. There's a sort of growing pressure on the market that can be through increased population growth. It can also be through increased commercialization of goods. In the first wave that took place in the late medieval, early modern period, just before that, we see a huge development in Europe of what is called the Great Reclamation. So agricultural land was reclaimed massively in those times because the population was growing, it needed to be fed. And at the same time, we also see commercialization, the growth of cities across Europe. Now, that puts a lot of pressure on people's livelihoods because, well, there's more people basically wanting the same goods and services. So they want to keep up the quality. So that's the moment when you see the collectives as the agricultural commons that try to preserve pasture land, but also guilds that try to preserve quality and minimum wages. That you see them popping up across Europe. The second wave I was talking about, the one when you see cooperatives emerging, well, that's basically starting after the population growth that starts in Europe around 1750. It's a story where the potato plays an important role as a way to feed more people. So you see population growth, also increasing commercialization, and increasing search among philosophers, politicians, nobility as well, to invest in another type of economy to feed their population. Also, a period with a lot of wars going on, and where governments were also basically looking for more soldiers. So the idea there was that there was a growing pressure. So, but at the same time, people did not want to lose out on those collective forms they had. And right after this period, you see the new types of cooperatives are popping up. And what is leading to today's new development, although we don't know yet if they will have the same size as in the past, is also increasing pressure, but then through the increasing privatization we've seen since the 1980s. So increasing scarcity, basically, of goods like care and renewable energy, etc. Now, the ends of these waves are also a bit different. In the first wave, we've seen rapid top-down dissolution, governments dissolving these organizations. In the second wave, something else happened when organizations disappeared, when cooperatives ceased to exist. It was often because they were merged with other cooperatives, and they became very large cooperatives over time. The type of, for example, Raiffeisen banks, Rabobanks, etc. They became so large because of merger. Now, interestingly, it seems like these are three separate periods, but in between we do see some transfer of functions over time, and we also see that they scale in a different way over time. I'm going to run you very quickly through that so you get an idea of how these organizations develop and grow. What I was just saying, transfer of functions, we see that guilds, after a while, split up between masters and their employees, basically, the journeymen, and they have their own services for their own group. And after the dissolution of this whole first wave of collective action, we see that their functions and insurance, but also defending labor rights, they move on to mutuals and labor unions. So there's basically another type of organization taking care of some of the functions of these organizations.
Professor, sorry,
yeah,
apologies for interrupting. Is it possible to increase the pace? I think we only have like 3 or 4 minutes left maximum.
Okay,
I'm so sorry. This is very inspiring,
I have very little left.
we have to wrap up slowly. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly. So over time, we see that organizations scale in a different way. In the first wave, we see that organizations split it up, but didn't communicate a lot with each other. It's very uncoordinated. There was no organization that took care of the rights or commons for a whole country or less, but nor for the guilds. And that made them very vulnerable. When we look at this graph, I'm not going to say everything, but you see, this is a graph showing you on the right-hand side when all the commons in just as part of the Netherlands ceased to exist. And you see that they all disappeared more or less at the end of the 18th century. They were very vulnerable because they did not unite. They did not talk to each other. They had no way to defend themselves. In the second wave, as I said, they merge. So these organizations are less vulnerable because they merge and they become very large. They often become as large as other capitalist organizations that are also very large corporates. Now, what happens today is actually very interesting, and it's also a call for action for you in the audience, I think. What we see today is that organizations prefer to stay small. That's a bit like in the early modern period in Europe, they want to stay small, but they do unite through networks. And that shows that the movement is reaching a certain level of maturity, I think. What we've seen over the past 10 years, more or less, is that lobby networks per sector emerge for these organizations. On the European level, we've seen it happening for the European energy cooperative, and it has effect. In the Netherlands, we see it for different other sectors like agriculture, but also care, etc. Now, there is a network strategy behind this, and these networks, they try to defend the alternative governance form these organizations stands for. And the question is, does it have an effect? And I think it does. If you look at the German example, you see that there was a rapid growth in the 2000s, beginning of the century, in new forms of energy cooperatives, and that has led to the German energy transition to a large extent. At some point, about 40–50% of the renewable energy produced in Germany was actually produced by this type of organization. So very important there to learn that a network strategy can contribute to the energy transition. This is my call for action, and then I will show you very quickly what can be done. It shows that we don't need just to combine all these commons per sector, but it would be good if this could also be done over countries. And we've started to do this with a platform in the Netherlands called collectivepower.eu. It's in Dutch mainly, but we launched 2 weeks ago a first version of the English platform. And what we do is we bring together stakeholders involved in this new movement in labs, and we try to organize all sorts of events with lots of people attending, with publications, with accessible videos, etc., trying to support this movement from the bottom up with evidence-based material. Now, my call for action to you is to help us spread our approach. It's based on what we call an extreme citizen science approach, whereby citizens themselves are very much involved in feeding scientists with questions, but also doing research together and helping out each other on this field. There's a nice YouTube video you can watch. The link is underneath, but maybe can be spread later on. That helps you to understand how we work. And we're going to launch this. Well, we're going to extend this platform across Europe in the next few years. We have a large project going on about that as well. So if you want to be part of that, check in, have a look at it, and let us know, because this is a bigger thing that I think needs connecting, needs networking across Europe. Thank you.
Professor De Moor, thank you for this excellent presentation. I think it is a great start for our first plenary, that we see that it's not only a historical framework of the past, but we can take lessons and be inspired and encouraged for the future. Now, please welcome our next speaker, Mete Hatay, who's here with us. He discusses commoning as a civic response to ecological and democratic crisis, drawing from peace-building and environmental examples in Cyprus. He will talk on how we can rebuild both our planet and our civic ecosystems through shared care and collaboration. Please again welcome Mete Hatay. Floor is yours.
Hello, I can hear myself. Yes, we're not going to experience a techno-fascism with me, I hope, in that sense. I will concentrate on, before commoning, the urgency, as Professor Calhoun put it nicely, how the world is changing and turning into these popular right movements and all these rising new so-called charismatic leaders. They are more than charismatic leaders, they're more trickster kind of characters. How populism is, in a sense, that transforming the whole world into a very, very dangerous space. In connection with this rising popular right wing, we could also see the urgency of the ecological disaster, because in this particular populism, there is no sympathy for the ecology. So I'm going to move from the global to Cyprus with my talk. So I'll talk about what this urgency is, first of all. We meet today in what some authors on impending climate catastrophe have begun to call the age of urgency. We all know that there's a rapidly closing window to prevent irreversible ecological damage to our planet. Scientists tell us that the time available for meaningful action is shorter than the time our institutions need to respond. This gap produces not only environmental crisis, but also temporal anxieties, the sense that future is not arriving, but disappearing. The face of foreshortened futures. Like these young people, so many of us experience the urgency, but feel we have no agency. We know what must change, but we feel increasingly unable to change it. In Cyprus, as you know, it's a common thing to hear, nothing can change, hiçbir şey olmaz, olamaz, vesaire. It becomes a kind of like a fatalistic declaration of accepting what is there to come. And it undermines any kind of resistance for what is coming. When we look at the urgency and Cyprus, for more than, first of all, of course, Cyprus problem is our national sport. I have to connect to that as well. For more than 6 decades, Cyprus has lived in a political logic of postponement, no urgency, where everything waits on the negotiated solution to the division. Phrases like, not now, later. The stars are not aligned. After the next election, or after the next United Nations envoy. This one was very biased. After Ankara, Athens, Brussels, Washington, shift. Yeah? But all this, postponement goes on, but the land does not wait. The nature destruction does not wait. Troodos Mountains burns more frequently. Same with Five Finger Mountains, Beş Parmaks. Amorpho aquifer sinks lower every year. Karpaz dries and loses biodiversity. Limassol's coastline recedes, and floods we see in Kyrenia more regularly. New infrastructures, fences, investments, and demographic patterns build realities that solidify partition. More apartments, more quarries, more apartments, more quarries, more workers to work for the apartments, more expats to use the apartments. So, and no infrastructure and no preparation for what to come. A suspended conflict in a non-suspended environment, we can call it. The conflict remains static while changes in the ecosystem accelerate with a very fast pace. Our political leaders continue as if time were abandoned, as if the future were merely postponed rather than endangered. Cyprus is no longer a frozen conflict. It is conflict outpaced by time. So what are the limits of our current political arrangement? Let's look into that. Both leadership have settled into managing division rather than resolving it. Leadership, when I say not today, the previous ones, the other previous ones and everything. So management of the conflict is their first priority rather than resolving it. That is partly this changing environment in Cyprus creates certain comforts on both sides. So I believe that it's the time to look at who is benefiting from this comfort and of course, we have to talk about the sufferer of this conflict, but concentration on the benefits might expose, we might call the king naked, in a sense. In the North, dependency without direction, a language of dignity without sovereignty, improvisation, making do's instead of institution building are the products of this mentality. In the South, you have the reliance on EU membership as an insulation, caution replacing strategy, a discourse of support for solution without sustained political investment, and paranoia of recognition by implication, meaning don't do anything, it might imply recognition. Meanwhile, the international system has stabilized the status quo. There are certain responsibilities that they have. The UN has prioritized process over results. Comprehensive settlement. Let's concentrate on the holistic approach of comprehensive settlement. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That means nothing is agreed. Yeah? So on the ground, a lot of things changes, but nothing is agreed to change these changes in a sense. The EU, by admitting only one side, they made the mistake already, and this has entrenched the asymmetry. The recent European Parliament decision on establishing a monument for the missing person, it was the result of the asymmetry that has caused asymmetry or epistemic asymmetry, the knowledge asymmetry, yeah? But that means asymmetric injustice in that sense. So you must make more efforts to hear all sides, not on equal sense, but little bit more investment should go there. Not EU coming to tell us, but we should tell EU as well. So these kind of gatherings should be held, commonings should be held in Brussels as well to redress the asymmetry in a sense. Guarantor states treat Cyprus as a strategic real estate rather than a lived homeland. Their geopolitical interests are more important solving the Cyprus problem. So the bargain goes upwards. And in this upwards bargaining, the power, the geopolitics becomes the main factors or dynamics. So this has created not peace, not war, but administrative stalemate. The age of urgency is revealing the limits of this arrangement. It is not sustainable, not socially, not politically, and certainly not ecologically. It's coming. Globally, we are in danger, but Cyprus, especially with the divided society, with the divided island, it's no preparation, or one side prepares more, the other side has no responsibility, is calling for urgency. So, let's move on to commoning as civic ecology. Where do we go from here? I want to propose commoning as practical civic ecology, a way of managing our shared natural existence that builds durable relations, institutions, and interdependence. That's the key word for coexistence. If you don't have interdependence, you either have dependence or submission. So, interdependence is the key for any sustainable relationship. So, the commoning is not symbolic coexistence, but everyday cooperation. Not a single project, but a reorganization of how life is lived. Infrastructural, not just performative. Those are good, romantic. It can create some kind of, it can trigger certain things, but it has to somehow be like an infrastructural thing, sustain its durability should be there. You can have many festivals, many whatever, but if it doesn't leave its marks, it's usually a waste of time. So, in short, infrastructural, not just performative. durational, not seasonal. Bakhtin, the Russian philosopher and writer, came up with this concept of carnavalesque. Carnavalesque means carnival used as resistant tool. Yeah, some societies you cannot express your feelings, especially now when the democracy is degenerated everywhere. Use carnavalesque methods to raise your voices. But the problem with, and it is widely used nowadays, but the problem with that is it has a expiry date, like every carnivals. It starts Friday, finishes on Sunday. And carnivals can turn the king into clown, clowns into king. You can voice your voices, anything you like, but that has to sort of have a spillover effect on the societies. Otherwise, it doesn't have the effect that it envisions. And we have a lot of carnivalesque spaces in Cyprus as well. Yeah, we call them bubbles, preaching to the converts and everything. So that is the other little obstacle. These places are all with good intentions, but because they are more performative than being infrastructural, they are more selective and has a expiry date. It is not sustainable. So what we can do, let's start with short things that what we can do, and there are a lot of examples of that here, like in Cyprus, when we look at Cyprus, ecological. We can start with shared urban composting, for example, yeah? Seed banks. Soil becomes a shared memory of care. Then the sensitivity towards soil nature becomes a common thing. Yeah? So this kind of agricultural, ecological project should be practiced more often. We do have them, but more common and wider sense. Cultural, bilingual oral history recording labs, because we have a lot of memory problems in Cyprus. Everybody has their own memory. Of course, we believe in multi-perspectivity, but at some point, we have to put this multi-perspectivity in one place, in a common space, that we can create a common perspective from here, with its diverse sort of visions. Mobility. For a while they started, they stopped now. Bi-communal bicycle courier service, for example, in the old city. It transgressed the borders, yeah? Cooperative urban gardens in abandoned buffer plots. These are all soft but simple issues, but it has a wider effect, as the previous speaker was talking about. Where commoning already exists, successful, but also we can be a little bit critical of these commonings. Let's take Home for Cooperation. I'll give you an example. I was part of when it was coming to being. Yeah, it was a fantastic commoning initiative by the history teachers on both sides. It was a civil society initiative. It was a civic initiative, and then it transformed into the infrastructural we talk about. Yeah, it is there. The durable place is there. And you have a lot of, I don't need to go into the activities they do and everything. But what is the problem there? Not problem, but the limitation there, can be a carnivalesque space. Yeah? Not activity, but a space. It's in the buffer zone. And you do a lot of things there. Once you are out of the buffer zone, you cannot take everything that you experience there. So that should be there as the first contact point. It's a space for commoning, but that should follow by crossing to each other's sides. The most successful commoning, in a sense, started with the local governance here. We all know that, yeah? The shit unites. The Nicosia Swage system. It was the first successful, really sustainable project that was back in 80s or late 70s. It was less poetic, of course, in that sense, but structurally profound. A shared municipal system planned, funded, maintained, and repaired across the dividing line. A civic commons literally running beneath the ground. Yes, and also it inspired further structural commonings, like the building we are in now. This is the product of the example they set back in 80s of the Swedish Commons Nicosia-Suez system, and it led to the Nicosia master plan, where both sides, historical places started to be renovated, and that sites particularly chosen in spaces that you didn't have much access, so that created generation around it, and now we're having this beautiful conference here, and many other activities take place here. Yes, the other most important common initiative I see is the families of the missing. Perhaps the most powerful example, in a sense. Their cooperation demonstrates how common pain can be dealt. Shared grief as a political language that transcends nationalism. The establishments on both sides. The insistence that every life has equal value. A refusal of narratives that convert human pain into political blame, like the attempt that was done by some of the MEPs in European Parliament. And they are the first ones to react to that. Both sides, missing persons family, react to that. They said, look, you cannot politicize and exploit our grief like that. Their work includes supporting exhumation and identification processes, encouraging testimonies from both sides, because in some senses, the victims can be perpetrators. There are a lot of vendetta killings in Cyprus. Advocating jointly to political leaders in a way that encouraged the CMC to work harder. It became structural in that sense. For a long period of time, CMP was functioning as two diplomats meeting and saying we cannot do anything about it. And for the last 20 years, with opening of the checkpoints, this families gathering and certain journalists like Sevgül Uludağ, Paraskos, getting together and creating a common vision for the lost ones, the lost loved ones of these people, has a profound effect on reconciliation as well. But this is a quiet reconciliation, no depends on agreements. So they're saying that, never mind. Yeah, I mean, Cyprus has lived more than 60 years in the assumption that there will always be more time. But the age of urgency tells us there is no more time. The question is no longer, can Cypriots live together? The question is, will we act together before the land that holds us becomes unrecognizable to all of us, or livable in a sense, yeah? If political elites cannot move, society must. If institutions cannot imagine the future, the commons must keep it open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mete. Thank you for, shaking us a little bit and reminding some uncomfortable truths in this comfort zone that we have, which is a constant at the same time. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And now our final speaker, last but not least, Mr. Dr. Jose Ramos, an action researcher and a futurist from Queensland University of Technology, invites us to think about the invisible commons of our era, our shared attention, information, and mental space. He proposes, if I'm not mistaken, and he'll explain it a lot better than I do, of course, a meta-language of the commons as a way to collectively govern our civic sphere and counter today's cognitive crisis. Please welcome Dr. Ramos all the way from Australia. Floor is yours, Dr. Ramos.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very touched and honored to present and to be among such distinguished company and so many progressive spirits fighting and articulating the commons. I've been inspired by the talks given by all the different professors proceeding. So thank you very much for inviting me in. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen, and if I can just get an indication that it's actually working, that would be great. It looks like it's working. Okay, good. All right, so so yeah, I think the first I'm going to start with the beginning of this journey of invisibility, which is that we're living in the era of intensive capitalism. This is an idea by Professor William Robinson, who's a professor of political economy. Basically, he argues that capitalism had an extensive phase, which basically means that it moved geographically extensive. You know, that was colonialism, imperialism. That was 400 years ago. The mercantile movement to India, the Dutch East India Company. But we can also see that extensive phase of capitalism all the way into the 1960s and 70s, the opening up of China and India, entering the sphere of a global capitalist political economy. When he basically argues that we've moved into an era of intensive capitalism, that as capitalism exhausts its realms of commodification, it has to find new places that it can commodify. And therefore, it goes inward. It goes into this intensive phase, which basically means it begins to look for profit making within the life world, the imagination, and the relational domain of human beings. You know, it's the privatization of the intersubjective world, of our relationships. It also includes intellectual property. It includes our data. It includes also, exploitation that also derives from the digital economy. You know, we've seen, for example, a class action against Meta, against Facebook, by moderators who are traumatized by having to moderate horrendous content day in and day out. They're underpaid and they're being subjected to these kind of horrible moderation experiences. So the crisis of intensive capitalism is what he argues we're in now. And it leads us into this whole realm of assaults against the civic sphere. We're already aware of algorithms that drive social polarization.
Dr. Ramos, so sorry for interrupting. The slides are not changing yet. I'm not sure if they were supposed to be, but I guess it was relevant that it would change with the last one. Sorry. Yep.
Yeah. No. We're still on the same slide. Yeah. So I'm gonna just go through, first of all, what are the different assaults on the civic sphere that we see in this era of intensive capitalism. And first of all, I think we should just note that the material, or you call material capitalism based on on property, on the raw power of financial assets, hasn't ended, right? So the power of the lobby sector is more powerful than ever. And as we saw in the last election in the United States, the Biden government actually wanted to bring in very strong antitrust against Google, against Meta. And so there's a reason why many of these tech billionaires, the people who are driving this intensive capitalism, supported Trump and kind of tipped him over the edge. So there's an enclosure and capture of the material state that's part of the this process of intensive capitalism. These are the owners and controllers of the forces that are assaulting this civic sphere. We also have the cannibalization of the social body. So intensive capitalism drives a whole number of behaviors. It drives addiction among children, digital addiction among children. It drives a whole number of other pathologies that create a kind of fragmentation, a withering of social capacity. And then we have the proprietary control of public discourse. So we don't know what the algorithms are that are controlling the kinds of conversations that we have. You know, we get hints every now and again, you know, because when we're having a conversation, maybe a conflict is bumped up within our conversations on LinkedIn or on Facebook. Maybe there's social polarization, and then the research starts to come in that, okay, the way that these platforms are controlled, the way that the algorithms operate are in the interests of the companies, and they're not in the interest of a kind of dialogue or conversation that leads to solutions or that creates more solidarity, right? So there's a fundamental interest behind these platforms. I mean, we unwittingly moved from physical public spaces to digital public spaces. You know, there was a kind of unwittingness about this, but the drive for profit is not unwitting. You know, this is something that you know, that theorists and that policymakers have understood for a very long time. John Maynard Keynes talked about animal instincts. He talked about trying to tame capitalism and trying to bring in a kind of social democracy that can kind of balance out. But I think here we're just seeing that these the animal instincts are driving the governance of our of the places in which we're having these conversations, and therefore creating these perverse outcomes. And then we have the subjective transformation of the citizen, which basically means that the image of self that people have is being transformed from a collective sense that we are part of a collective and that we work together, which is the primordial image of who we are, you know, coming from the deep past. We lived in communities and we had to work together to survive, you know, and that collectivism is a fundamental part of what it is to be a human being. But that over time, that image of self gets transformed into an atomized sense of self. I'm an individual, and the logic of my life is to get more stuff. The logic of my life is to compete. And so the subjective transformation of the citizen is also pretty fundamental to the public sphere as well, because in order to have a public sphere, we have to have people who care about working together, solving problems together. And again, like back to this, you know, the previous point about the proprietary control of these of public discourse, that will also influence the discourses that we see. You know, even in the use of AI, we don't know what algorithms are being used to govern the responses and how people are going to get responses that help them make sense of the world around them. So the subjectivity and how we look at ourselves is fairly fundamental. So to recap, the intensive capitalism is engaging in an assault on the civic sphere in these four major ways. And several people already talked about the commons, and what we are finding, or what the argument here is, that as intensive capitalism assaults these different dimensions of the public sphere, the commons that are implicit within the public sphere are becoming surfaced. So Elinor Ostrom, the great kind of economist who won a Nobel Prize for really establishing the idea of commons-based governance. One of her students, David Bollier and Silke Helfrich, they really tried to map many different types of commons, and so now we understand commons to have many different modalities, many different types, as Professor de Moor pointed out. These different domains of existence, whether it's agriculture, whether it's energy, whether it's a whole number of different things. And so when we go deeper into this idea of what are the commons that are under assault by intensive capitalism, there's a way to begin to think about this. And the way that I think about it is that commons are those things that we mutually need for our survival and well-being, such that we must collectively manage, protect, and govern them. So if there's something that we understand that we collectively need, then and we see our survival and well-being tied into those commons, then we are driven to collectively manage them, protect, and govern them. Now, the logic of this is it moves from implicit to explicit. But there are many commons that are implicit that we don't even realize are commons until they become under threat. So we can see that with our atmosphere, for example, that the last 10,000 years, we've lived in the Holocene. We lived in an era of a fairly stable climate, and we took that for granted. And now with climate change and with the climate emergency, now we don't take that for granted. We know that we actually need a safe climate, that is a commons that we mutually need for our survival and well-being. And we have to collectively manage, protect, and govern this. So this particular commons has moved from implicit to explicit. And so the argument is that within the assault, intensive capitalism's assault on the public sphere, that has shifted many of these things that we've taken for granted from implicit to explicit. And so I'm just going to map this briefly. So there are the four different dimensions that I mentioned before. And then when we think about the commons that are being assaulted, we can look at it in this way. So the enclosure and capture of the material state. Well, there's the commons around public life, justice, and collective decision-making. We actually want our governance systems not to be corrupted. We want them to reflect the will of the people. We don't want lobbyocracy. We don't want lobby groups and oligarchs running our countries. With the cannibalization of the social body, we want social reproduction, health, and collective well-being to be protected. This is a commons. If you don't have people who are well, if you have kids that are addicted to digital content, or adults for that matter, and all the other pathologies that we might see, we got a problem. With proprietary control of public discourse, we need a shared ability to know. We need a shared reality, a way that we can make decisions together. So polarization or creating bubble realities, echo chambers, right? That's the issue here. So the epistemic commons, our ability to create shared ways of knowing together, is quite fundamental. And then with the subjective transformation of the citizen, we've got a kind of psychological and moral commons. What is the image of who we are? How can we ensure that there's a moral and ethical basis for how we work collectively? And so this is my kind of hypothesis here, is that the intensive capitalism has these four assaults, and these are the implicit commons that are moving from implicit to explicit. We never questioned a kind of epistemic commons because we didn't have such radical kind of technologies creating bubble realities and echo chambers, flat earth communities and everything else. Now we do, and now we have to kind of grapple with that challenge. And then there's relationships between these, and I think the complexity here, and this kind of touches a little bit on what Professor de Moor was talking about in the last couple of slides, which is that there needs to be some kind of ability to create relational coherence across these. If they're just isolated, they're weak. If we have movements to protect these different commons in isolation, they're not going to be as strong. We need coherence. And so the idea that I want to propose here is a meta language of the commons, which is a way for diverse commoning activities to communicate, coordinate, and find mutual support. And I guess the metaphor I'm using here is Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, that was invented by Tim Berners-Lee, which allowed all these different computers around the world to communicate. They could be on different different systems, but if they used the same protocol, they were able to communicate. And what I'm trying to say here, I guess the hypothesis here is that we need a meta language of commoning that's going to allow us to work across multiple different types of commoning activity. Such a protocol would enable an ecology of the commons in the face of centrifugal forces of intensive platform capitalism. So meta language of the commons, what is that all about? Well, it's protocol of mutual intelligibility. If one group is working on one type of commons, they're able to create some kind of mutual intelligibility with the other group working on a different type of commoning activity, right? So there has to be a way of understanding. There's a survival logic that there has to be a way for one group to understand that their survival and well-being is tied up with the other group's survival and well-being. And I heard that in a number of the different talks, in terms of how does one group understand themselves implied into the struggle of another group. There's empathy and intersectional coherence. My struggle, as a Mexican, who was raised in California and had a kind of Mexican identity, but I also understand that women suffer from patriarchy. I also understand that African Americans have suffered from racism. That my identity is not just taking me down my own trauma rabbit hole, my own trauma path. Decentralized multiplicity, to understand that there's a lot of different new ways of different types of organizations. I think Professor de Moor's presentation on the different types of commoning activities and institutions is useful right there, because it's kind of showing there are these different forms. They don't have to be the same form. They could be networks. They could be co-ops. They can be this. They can be that. But they can work. They can be social movements. But they have to be able to, in a sense, try to find a way to work together. Trauma and identity, I mentioned that, and epistemic humility. That we within a larger body of struggles need to try to understand sit in the other person's shoes, sit in the other person's chair. Okay, so so I'm just going to wrap up now with the last in the last minute. So really, it's a cultural ethos of radical interdependence and care. You know, how can we relate? And the epistemic commons and pluralistic practice that is going to allow us to continue to create the kind of coherence that is going to allow us to respond to the assault of intensive capitalism on the public sphere. And I'll just skip this slide, and maybe I'll just finish with this last slide here, that the meta-language as protocol, it's really about turning fragmentation into coherence. But the problem is that intensive capitalism succeeds by promoting types of fragmentation: capture, cannibalization, proprietary control, atomization. And the strategy is protocols of reciprocation, ways in which we can work across commoning efforts in the most coherent possible way. There are many experiments around the world, you know, that have worked on this, and it's a long path. You know, the narrative is long, and we're simply going to have to continue to create and walk this together. Thank you.
Ramos, thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. I think we all feel the same way. You took us to think about the ideas that we don't normally actually think and challenge. So thank you again very much for joining. Now, even though we're a little bit behind the schedule, we can get 1 or 2 questions for our online speakers. And also, of course, to Mete, but we're lucky to have Mete physically with us. So you can also talk and chat with him during the break. So please, now the floor is yours, dear participants, if you want to direct any questions. Anyone? Okay.
Thank you for this panel. My question goes to Mete Hatay. I am really wondering, this is actually a question for all of us to think, you know, collectively and to act collectively. How can we form alliances that move beyond performative or short-lived initiatives, you know, to address the ecological emergency and advance peace and reconciliation in Cyprus and elsewhere? I mean, I don't have an answer, but I want to think collectively, as I said. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, I mean, there are a lot of initiatives trying to do something about this ecological destruction that is coming, partly because of the climate change and partly because of the economic production, which causes, especially in the north, in a space that is not under surveillance, under any kind of international observation. It's hit-and-run economy has been developed here, and so because they are not recognized, they don't feel obliged to obey anything in that sense, yeah? So that is causing a huge problem. You know, so there are, what I can suggest, locally, we have to voice and we have to see the urgency. So a lot of awareness raising should be there. I mean, because people has digested what changes gradually, you know, and they forget about the consequences of this. It's become like part of everyday life in that sense, and that fatalistic approach that has developed in Cyprus, that nothing can change. Oh my God, we have no, you know, power or anything. No, each individual can have a contribution to this thing. But by becoming in a common struggle, you'll be stronger. For example, I give it's self-promotion now. I'll give an example. We just finished a film on the environmental destruction in Cyprus, and we were shocked to see the interest of the people. And after we arranged two, pre-arranged screening, now we following snowball. People calling us. So we go to the coffee shop, we show it, we go to all the civil society institutions, the municipalities, and we are quite busy at the moment in that sense. So this kind of awareness raising is important, and while this is going on, also we have to prepare certain steps, what can be done, how do we influence political parties. Since, as you know, we don't have any overseer in that sense, yeah? If somebody is to be sued, it's Turkey, it's not the Turkish Cypriots, yeah? So, and that is very seldom in a sense that, so this lack of responsibility, and the politics of responsibility in Cyprus has to be tackled. So the political parties have to have the environment as the priority. The other disadvantage, I'm just finishing, is the Cyprus problem, which is, it's a blanket for everything. Let's talk about Cyprus, anti-Cyprus problem. So nothing can be done kind of attitude. We have to tackle that as well, because there are Cyprus problems, not one problem.
Thank you very much, Mete. I think there's one more question here first. I'm not going to be able to take too many questions as we're 10 minutes, experiencing a 10 minutes delay, so apologies for that. But let's take last two questions together. Maybe they're the same question, we never know. First, please go ahead and please tell us who you're asking the question. And then, before answering, we're going to take another question as a last question. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Well, my question is specifically for Professor Jose, but of course, I would like to tackle everybody's mind on this issue. My question is a bit maybe progressive, but as capitalism emerged from combined forces of changes in agriculture and modern industrialization, and as these two forces work together to create a new economic oppressive system, this system that we live at right now, capitalism, as you said, it's always limiting our space, our common space. So for me personally, I believe that the only solution is erasing capitalism. Do you think that this is the only solution for us to gain back our commons? Because right now, I feel like we're privileged enough to tackle the problem of commons while a lot of people in many countries are experiencing genocides and a lot of things. So, yeah, I would like to know that.
Thank you. If the other question is very, very brief, please, let's just hear that, and we'll give the floor to our speakers to wrap up.
Yes, so my question was to Jose. How much our civic space is in a safe and sustainable situation when mostly used social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp are owned by one single company? And what is the alternative to make our channels more sustainable? Thank you very much for
Thank you. So, Dr. Jose Ramos, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll try to make it really brief because I think Professor de Moor would also have something to say about this. So I will say, well, the first one, the question is, do we have to get rid of capitalism? We absolutely need to develop a new political economy that isn't just profit driven. We have to have one, Professor de Moor showed all the different cooperatives and all the different beautiful history of commoning activity, implicit commoning activity, explicit commoning activity. We need political economies that support that, or else we're always going to be playing catch up. So I would say yes. And I think specifically with the platforms and in our digital worlds, they either have to be incredibly heavily regulated. Those algorithms have to be governed for the public good. Right now, they're governed for profit, creating all kinds of social externalities, polarization, addiction, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I think there's a couple of different prongs there. One is, yes, long term, we're going to have to create new political economies. I don't see how we can, continue to live publicly decent lives without that. But then in the short term, I think regulation, and we're going to have to recapture the state, and that's going to be hard, but we've got to do it. Some countries are closer than others for that. For the second question, I'm trying to recall exactly the idea, but maybe Professor de Moor, you remember what the gentleman said better than I did. So,
Okay. Ali Furkan, can you remind your question? Can you re-ask your question to Dr. Ramos, please? Microphone. Wait for the microphone.
So basically, I was trying to say, for our commons and civic space, where and in which channel we are communicating is very important. And
of course.
Like when I am listening your presentation on capitalism, I was making a thought that we see also a monopoly situation in social media platforms and how much this is sustainable. And I believe you were answering when you said algorithms has to be used for public good, not for profit. So if you want to add something more, that's fine, but I think I am good.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
It seems like you already actually answered it both during your presentation. And if you want to add some last remarks, Dr. Ramos, for this question. Otherwise, we are already behind our schedule. We're going to slowly close. So if you don't...
Yeah, I mean,
Thank
I'll
all
just
three of
quickly
you for
say
your
that
inspiring presentations. This was a great start. Okay. Sorry. Tine, did you want to say something? Last remark?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just say one last thing, if that's okay, which is that we've reached a dead end because these platforms are that we want to, reinvigorate the public sphere, the civic sphere, but they're captured. They're captured platforms. So we're going to have to walk and chew gum, as they say. We're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to have to get ourselves out of that dead end of these proprietary digital platforms as we recapture the state, as we recapture our governance and regulatory systems, and begin to govern the digital commons for the public good.
Thank you very much. Okay, together, thank you again for your presentations and for joining us. Together we've seen how commons can help us navigate ecological urgency, civic fragmentation in the times of intensive capitalism, as Dr. Ramos put it. And commoning, as we heard, isn't just a nostalgic idea. It can be a living practice of cooperation and renewal. As we close our first plenary session, we're hoping that you're going to join us for our next session, when we will move from commoning to reclaiming the truth as an indispensable common. Thank you very much.
have some friendly reminders before we go on our lunch break. I want to remind you all that outside we have 14 civil society stands, so please go and visit them, say hi, find out what they're doing. If you haven't registered for any of the afternoon workshops today, which are in 4 different locations starting at 3:30, please make sure that you do at 4:30. Sorry, please make sure you do that at the information desk, and please meet us back here at 1:30 to start our second plenary session. Thank you very much. good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Just a friendly reminder if you need translation to please take your headsets just near the entrance over there. Before we start our next session, I also want to remind you that after this session, we have our parallel workshops for the afternoon, and that includes the coffee break. So as soon as this session finishes, I want you all to go straight back to your workshops, but I'll talk more about that later. So this afternoon, our second plenary session is called Reclaiming Truth as an Indispensable Common in the Age of Post-Truth, Polytruth, and Fugitive Truth. Today, we are very lucky to have two very special speakers with us today. I will introduce them quickly. Saul Newman is Professor of Politics at Goldsmiths University of London. His research is in the area of contemporary political and democratic theory, including topics such as radical politics and anarchism, human rights, political theology, populism, and post-truth politics. He is the author of and editor of over a dozen books. Our other speaker today is Martijn de Waal. He's a professor at the Civic Interaction Design Research Group at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. He is co-author of books such as The Platform Society, Public Values in a Connective World, The Hackable City, Digital Media and Collaborative City-Making in the Network Society, and The City as Interface, How Digital Media Are Changing the City. Our moderator for this session is Nazar Erişkin, and I'm handing over to you now, Nazar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pembe. Ben Türkçe olarak yapacağım. I will talk in Turkish. Maybe you want to use your CiviCon'un ilk günü ve ikinci oturumu. Herkese merhaba. Öğleden önceki oturumda müştereklerimizden bahsettik ve sonra yemeğe gittik. Umarım yemekleri beğendiniz ama umarım rehavet çökmedi üzerinize. Çünkü hakikatten bahsedeceğiz bu oturumda. Son derece önemli bir konu. Aslında bunu size söylüyorum ama Cadılar Bayramı'nı kutlamak için biz buradayız. İtirazı olan var mı? Çünkü bu benim hakikatim. Ben inanıyorum ki sizi buraya Cadılar Bayramı'nı kutlamak üzere topladık ve bu benim toplama biçimim. Herhangi birinizin itirazı var mı? Bu benim hakikatim. Anyone? İtirazı olan herhangi biri var mı? Hakikat o kadar eğilip bükülen bir şey ki vazgeçilmez bir ortak değer olarak yeniden sahiplenmeyi konuşacağız bugün hakikati. Ve bunu yaparken aslında hakikat dediğimiz şeyin belki de bugün en çok konuştuğumuz ama en az inandığımız kavram olduğunu söyleyebiliriz. Çünkü çok eğilip bükülebilen bir şey hakikat. Herkesin kendi gerçeği var ve öyle ki bu gerçekler bazı durumlarda bariz yalanlar olabiliyor gözümüze baka baka. Ama tıpkı hakikatmiş gibi kabul ediyoruz. Koca koca liderler bu sözde hakikatler üzerine kararlar alabiliyorlar. Bugün burada hem politik hem kamusal hem de bireysel düzeyde hakikatin nereye dönüştüğünü, bu bulanıklığın içinde hala ortak bir geleceğe, gerçekliğe tutunmanın mümkün olup olamadığını konuşacağız. Sivil aktörler olarak yanlış bilgi, komplo teorileri, manipülasyona karşı hakikati ve şeffaflığı nasıl savunabiliriz konularını irdeleyeceğiz hep birlikte. Diyalog, hesap verebilirlik ve demokratik tartışma yoluyla güveni nasıl yeniden inşa edebiliriz, hakikat temelinde birbirimize nasıl tekrar güvenebiliriz konuları için yanıtlar arayacağız. Bu tartışmayı da iki çok kıymetli isimle birlikte yürüteceğim için ben çok mutluyum. Ve Profesör Saul Newman'la başlayacağız. İlk olarak ona sözü bırakmak istiyorum. Hocamız Foucault'un farhezya kavramından yola çıkarak hakikati söylemenin artık bir siyasal direniş biçimi haline geldiğini söylüyor. Bize anlatacaklarını merakla bekliyorum.
That's what I like. Applause before the talk's even started. That's very gratifying. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here and to find out about your activities. I'm going to be talking about what I call fugitive truth. And fugitive truth is actually a reference, of course, to the very famous American political philosopher Sheldon Volan's notion of fugitive democracy. And by fugitive democracy, he means a form of democratic action, I suppose similar to what you guys are talking about, which is not confined to institutional settings. It's not sort of limited to voting or representative democracy. It's something which is more, takes place at a kind of a grassroots level of social movements, at the level of radical democratic activism. So I'm going to be trying to apply this notion of fugitive politics, if you like, to the question of truth, and trying to, address this problem that we have known as post-truth. So I'm going to be dealing with a number of P's today. We've got post-truth, we've got populism, we have the public sphere, and we have parousia. And parousia, of course, is Foucault's alternative theorization of truth, which is like the ancient practice of speaking truth to power. And I'm going to try to explore the idea that maybe parousia is a different kind of resignification of the relationship between truth and politics, which is a possible answer to the post-truth condition. But I'm going to be starting with Habermas and his very famous book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which was published in 1962. And here he charts the emergence during the 18th century of a public sphere coinciding with the rise of the social prominence of the bourgeois class. And he describes it as a sphere, and quotes it as a sphere of private people come together as a public. So for him, the public sphere referred to a new space of interaction and communication, which was distinct both from the market and the state, in which the public exercised its own independent critical power in judgment over the actions of the sovereign. And this was, for him, an unprecedented development in European society. So for centuries, the public, or publicity, had been confined to sovereignty and theatricalized in displays of authority and the rituals of the court. But with the European Enlightenment in the 18th century, and with the emergence of the bourgeoisie as the economically relevant class, a new kind of social power started to be exercised in salons, coffee houses, and through journals and newspapers. And this was a form of power based on free communication and deliberation, where public opinion was swayed by the force of the better argument, right, rather than the dictates of the law and the violence of the sovereign. So central here, of course, for Habermas was the use of public reason as a critical faculty in debating the issues of the day and forming independent judgments and opinions. Now, Habermas talks about the way in which this sort of once flourishing public sphere started to decline over the course of the 19th century due to certain developments, particularly the emergence of industrial capitalism and also the mass media, as well as the expansion of the welfare state. But when we think about it, the idea of democracy really, in some ways, presupposes and depends upon this notion of public communication. In other words, there has to be some sort of space in which citizens can actually, freely communicate, express their views, and form political opinions, right? So it's this kind of intersubjective space of deliberation, which Habermas sees as quite important, and which is really crucial, I think, to any coherent understanding of democracy. Now, the question today is, what is the status? What is the nature? What is the status of the public sphere today in the era of post-truth, right? So does it really exist today? Obviously, public opinion has for many decades been shaped and dominated by corporate interests, particularly the interests of the mass media organisations, and by the decades-long assault on public institutions as part of neoliberalism and neoliberal ideology. And this has been totally corrosive to the notion of the public sphere. And of course, today, and perhaps as a consequence of these preceding factors, public sphere is critically endangered by the onslaught of post-truth, right? So how do we define post-truth? Obviously there's many different definitions, but generally it refers to the preponderance of lies, mis- and disinformation, fake news, alternative facts, conspiracy theories, and the breakdown of trust in once established sources of knowledge and information. Post-truth is a condition where, as I put it, truth has lost its symbolic value in political discourse, right? And in political life generally, and where it's increasingly difficult to distinguish between factual truth and falsehood. Post-truth might be understood then as a certain transformation, and this is why actually I regard post-truth as more than simply a sort of an epistemic condition. It's actually a political condition, right? So it's a transformation in political culture where truth is no longer valued in public debate and where norms of factual accuracy become less important and where traditional sources of knowledge and information such as, scientific knowledge for legacy media and so on, and public institutions generally, are no longer trusted. So post-truth in this sense refers to more than simply political lying. This is actually a very important distinction. It's more than simply about political lying, because when you think about a lie, and particularly a political lie, in a sense, paradoxically reaffirms the status of truth in its transgression, right? So in other words, in some ways, a lie being the opposite of the truth suggests that there is a line between truth and falsehood. But I think this distinction, if you like, between truth and falsehood is more or less collapsed, essentially, and to the point where we can no longer really make that conceptual distinction. And it's also to do with a certain kind of indifference to truth. In other words, we don't really care anymore whether politicians lie, whether they propagate misinformation and fake news, and so we just don't care. We just sort of shrug our shoulders, and so we become indifferent to truth. Okay, so the emergence of the post-truth political culture is only obviously possible with the era of digital communications and social media, of course, which have largely supplanted traditional sources of knowledge and information like the mainstream media. We talked about echo chambers and internet filter bubbles and so on. And so these become sort of, vectors of disinformation and wild conspiracy theories. And of course, this situation is obviously exploited and exacerbated by populist politicians who are both cause and effect of post-truth political culture. So populist politicians spread disinformation, encourage conspiracy theories with the intention of fomenting distrust in the political establishment and in the mainstream media, which they denounce as fake news, and thereby intensifying political polarization and galvanizing key constituencies. So post-truth politicians no longer even pay lip service to the truth. They lie shamelessly and without repercussion, and in doing so they reproduce a political culture in which factual truth no longer seems to matter, or at least counts for less than appeals to emotion and identity. So, what this discourse does is really create a kind of an alternative political reality in which the line, once again, between truth and falsehood becomes blurred and indistinct. So it's clear, isn't it, why this post-truth political culture that I've been talking about poses such a threat to the notion of the public sphere and thereby to democratic life generally. The public sphere, as we know, is about this sort of free and undistorted communication between citizens. And this, of course, implies some consensus around basic facts, doesn't it? And of course, I'd refer you to Hannah Arendt's very famous essay from 1967, I think, called Truth and Politics, where she talks about the way in which, while truth and politics had never been on good terms, in the sense that the notion of absolute truth, as in mathematical truth, is in a sense antithetical to the sort of the plurality of the political world. I mean, politics for her is about opinion rather than absolute truth, but nevertheless, what she says is that to even have this pluralism, to even have this diversity and plurality of opinions, we actually need to agree around basic facts, right? Otherwise, there's no possibility of any kind of debate or discussion or deliberation at all. So paradoxically, plurality and the plurality of opinion depends upon an agreement around what you're actually talking about, right? And she was talking about the erosion of this consensus around facts back in the 1960s. It's a very, very prescient argument. She's basically predicting the post-truth political condition, which is obviously infinitely worse today. So what she talks about is a way in which this kind of erosion of basic facts, in a sense, she talks about the way in which it sort of pulls the rug from under our feet, and it makes it impossible to have any kind of cognitive mapping of the world in which we inhabit. In fact, it actually leads to the eclipse, if you like, of the common world of politics, the world in which we all share. Okay, so right, so we're obviously, this is obviously a very sort of real crisis with the notion of the public sphere. Habermas, in some recent reflections on the public sphere, where he's kind of reflecting on what's going on with public communications today, he talks about the way in which new digital communication technologies and the decline of the influence of the legacy media have contributed to the proliferation of what he calls semi-publics. So what he's really talking about here are kind of, if you like, internet echo chambers. So, groups of people who only talk to other like-minded people, particularly in the online spaces, on the online world. And this has, for him, this has kind of eroded the very boundary, if you like, between the public and the private, which was the field of tension upon which civil society and the traditional conception of the public sphere depended. So Habermas refers to what he calls a new structural transformation of the public sphere, and he believes that this is really kind of a clear and present danger to democracy itself, right? Because all opinions are sort of filtered, public debate is polarized. There's a kind of and there's also a real sort of fragmentation into different groups who don't really sort of talk or communicate with each other. They only kind of talk to themselves. So these depleted semi-public spheres have come to supplant or to replace the traditional public sphere. But interestingly, he says that these are not apolitical spaces. On the contrary, they are hyper-politicized, right? So post-truth is really to do with kind of a hyper-politicization of truth. Truth in post-truth discourse becomes a weapon to be deployed in an ideological battlefield. But this, I would say, that suggests that this hyper-politicization of truth is paradoxically also the condition for truth's disappearance from the political domain. So in other words, the more truth becomes politicized, the less relevant truth becomes to politics, or the less significant, the less valuable, if you like, truth becomes to politics. So the more truth becomes politicized, the less truth becomes a value, if you like, in political debates. This is the paradox, really, which I find quite interesting. Okay. So let's explore this notion of a new structural transformation of a public sphere. How can the public sphere be redeemed in the face of this onslaught from both the forces of post-truth and populism, which is a very sort of closely interrelated phenomena, as I've suggested? And is it possible really to have a different understanding of the relationship between truth and politics? So I think while we can agree with Hannah Arendt that the idea of absolute truth has no place, I'm talking about absolute truth, truth with a capital T, has no place in the sphere of politics, which is this pluralistic world of opinion, nevertheless politics, and she herself acknowledges this, politics must bear some relation to truth because it deals with matters of common concern and therefore makes claims to universal validity. So just as the imposition of an absolute truth would spell the end of democratic politics, so would the complete abandonment of truth from the political field. And in a sense, these are two sides of the same coin, right? So the imposition of an absolute truth on the one hand and the abandonment of truth on the other, in a sense, between them kind of means essentially the end of politics altogether. Both situations result in a kind of a totalization and a closure of the political space, right? So we need to rethink the idea of the public sphere and what it actually means today. What does it mean to actually enter the public sphere? What does it mean to communicate with one's fellow citizens? What does it mean to kind of engage and deliberate over political issues? What does it actually mean to take collective political action? And perhaps we need a more expansive notion of the public sphere to the one that Habermas kind of originally conceived. And of course, if you read critiques from people like Nancy Fraser and so on, it always was a very kind of limited bourgeois concept, right? So Nancy Fraser talks about, sort of counter-publics and sort of multiple public spheres rather than just one public sphere. And I think we need to kind of, if you like, revisit some of her critiques of the notion of the public sphere and to think about how the public sphere might actually be redeemed, expanded, radicalized, and so on. And once again, I think, the activities of CiviCon, I think, are a very good example of this. But I'm going to be talking mostly about protest movements, new social movements, movements which we're seeing today, movements which mobilize around questions of economic justice, racial justice, climate change, police violence, and even the defense of very, very basic democratic rights, which we can see are under threat all over the world. So, everything from, movements of occupation which appeared well over a decade ago, such as Occupy Wall Street, the movement of the squares in Cairo, Madrid, Athens, Istanbul, to more recent protest movements like Black Lives Matter, like Extinction Rebellion in the United Kingdom, which is obviously a climate justice movement, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement in France, and protests really in defense of democracy and human rights in all over the world: Chile, Poland, Romania, Georgia, Nepal, Madagascar, and of course right over the United States. You might be aware of the No Kings protest, the largest protest in US history, millions of people marching against, or protesting against democratic regression in the US. So what's going on here? How are these, and of course protests over Gaza, of course, is another very obvious example of this. So these movements, I would suggest, are essentially reinventing, in a very interesting way, the public sphere and taking it beyond the traditional bourgeois model, experimenting with different forms of political communication and interaction. They still entail the gathering of private individuals as a public, as Habermas originally conceived, and they certainly involve the autonomous exercise of public reason and critical judgment. But they also challenge the traditional boundaries of political life. Public deliberation is no longer confined to the polite civilities of bourgeois society, nor does it take a particularly institutionalized form. Politics, on the contrary, spills out onto the streets, occupies public spaces, experiments with direct and deliberative democratic decision-making in public assemblies, and it eschews or rejects traditional forms of political representation and communication. Sometimes these movements speak in a language which is quite alien and jarring and intended to disrupt the norms of political discourse, such as the chant of "I can't breathe," which was associated with Black Lives Matter and protests against racialized police violence. Sometimes they involve acts of violence, such as the destruction of property and symbols. And often they involve acts of civil, or as we can also call them, uncivil disobedience, such as blocking motorways, chaining themselves to aircraft to draw attention to carbon emissions and the climate crisis. Yet what links these various movements and convergences is the original idea of the public sphere, and also the principle of autonomy, which I'll say a bit about towards the end. The idea that people have a right to assemble, to communicate freely, to exercise their critical powers of judgment, and to make their own political decisions. These are really what kind of unite all of these very diverse movements. And what's also important, I think, is, and this is the point that someone like Judith Butler makes, is the convergence of bodies in public spaces. Craig Calhoun made the point about the importance of face-to-face communication or face-to-face interaction, and I would certainly agree with this point. Actually, I think it's one thing to communicate online; it's quite another to actually gather together in public places. So I think there's something very important about the mingling and the interaction of physical bodies in a kind of a physical space, and I think very interesting forms of politics are generated from that kind of bodily interaction. So these convergences not only reclaim space as public, they change our very understanding of the public space, breaking down the normal boundaries of public and private and opening up the political space to issues, concerns, and forms of subjectivity that have been traditionally excluded. So my claim here is that in challenging these conceptual boundaries, these movements also reanimate and re-energize the public sphere today, inventing new forms of public deliberation, communication, and citizen engagement. They're public not only in the sense that they seek visibility on the public stage, but also in the way in which they deepen and widen the scope of democratic participation and will formation. They're not the semi-publics that Habermas speaks about, in other words, echo chambers and so on, but I think there's something much closer to Nancy Fraser's idea of counter-publics, which in challenging the limits of a formal public sphere at the same time reinvigorate it, and where power is subjected to an ongoing critique in the name of rights or various democratic norms and values. Now the question I'd like to explore now really is, what is the relationship really between these new movements and these new forms of politics and truth? Do these new forms of politics, in other words, propose a different understanding of the relationship between politics and truth? Do they somehow redeem us from this post-truth political condition? Right? And this is where I want to turn to Michel Foucault and then go much further back into the ancient Greeks and Romans for a possible answer to this. Okay, so I turn to Michel Foucault's notion of parrhesia or parousia, which means frank and fearless speech. Frank and fearless speech, which refer to the ancient practice of speaking truth to power. So for Foucault, parrhesia was one of the chief ways of practicing what he called the care of the self that could be found in the cultures of ancient Greek and Roman antiquity. Parrhesia involved an obligation that one imposed upon oneself to speak the truth, regardless of the risks. And indeed, what gave parrhesia, according to Foucault, its particular ethical quality, was that it entailed an element of risk and therefore courage. He says in quotes, "Parrhesia is the free courage by which one binds oneself in the statement of truth, of freely binding oneself to oneself in the form of a courageous act." So in other words, speaking truth to power always entails risk, and it's precisely the risks which one incurs in speaking the truth, which gives parrhesia this kind of ethical dimension, which I would say is completely lacking in post-truth political discourse, right? Okay, so the parrhesiast often spoke truth at great personal risk, as Plato did when he gave unwelcome philosophical counsel to the tyrant Dionysus at Syracuse, or as Socrates, of course, himself did, when his philosophical interrogations antagonized the Athenian demos. So parrhesia is always a challenge to power, whether it's the power of the tyrant or even the power of the demos itself. And this is the interesting point here, I think. Parrhesia, while it emerges within the democratic situation, it presupposes democracy, it presupposes a certain kind of free speech, if you like. It can also go against the will of the people, or at least as the populace might frame it, right? It can go against the demos. It can speak out against what we might call public opinion or the will of the people. So it presupposed free speech and the equal rights of everyone to speak, what the Greeks call isagoria, but on the other hand introduced an ethical and critical dimension into political life that sometimes went against the democratic will. Unlike the populist who, like the demagogues of ancient times, panders to the will of the people, promising to give the people what they really want, the parrhesiast, by contrast, is not afraid to defy the majority will and to say and to do things which are unpopular, right? In the name of the truth. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. Sometimes, in fact, it's often uncomfortable and it's often politically unpopular. However, according to Foucault, this critical distance that the parrhesiast takes from the demos is essential to a well-governed democracy. While populism emerges from within the democratic space, and while populist leaders claim to be the ultimate democrats who speak for the people against the liberal elites, against the establishment, etc., they actually threaten to close down the democratic space by affirming a singular, unified, and homogeneous view of popular sovereignty whose will must be obeyed absolutely. Yet democracy cannot be absolutist in this sense, and it must be open to a plurality of different viewpoints and dissenting opinions. It must protect the rights and interests not only of majorities but also of minorities. So the democratic public sphere must be able to accommodate what Nancy Fraser calls counter-publics. Therefore, if democracy is to be governed well, if democratic decision-making is to be guided effectively and ethically regulated, it must be exposed to the ordeal of truth, to a principle that is different from it and sometimes in an antagonistic relationship with it. So when, for instance, contemporary climate justice activists block highways or shut down city centres and disrupt everyday life, they often risk antagonising majority opinion, not to mention risking fines, imprisonment, etc., arrest. Yet such acts of civil disobedience, which intend to confront people and governments with the truth of climate change, need to be seen as an essential part of democracy, even if they go against the will of the majority or the will of the demos. So in other words, it's this kind of it's this combative. We're talking about combat here. We're talking about truth wielded antagonistically. It's this combative element of truth against public opinion, truth against the demos, I think, which actually gives parrhesia its kind of critical distance from power and gives it this kind of ethical dimension which is totally lacking, I would say, in the discursive position of the populist. So to clarify this distinction, we can perhaps contrast, as indeed Foucault does, parrhesia on the one hand to sophistry and rhetoric on the other. And sophistry and rhetoric are discursive games designed merely to win an argument. You think of, Thrasymachus in the Republic, or to appeal to and manipulate the passions of the demos. Parrhesia, on the other hand, is characterized by what Foucault calls its plainness. It is ordinary, plain speech, by its absence, in other words, of rhetorical embellishment, as well as by the personal risk, which we've talked about, the personal risk that one assumes in speaking it. The populist, on the one hand, uses rhetorical games to further polarize the political field, to incite tensions and antagonisms, to provoke fears and anxieties, ultimately as a strategy of winning power. All right? By contrast, the parrhesiast, on the other, does not play the political game, even though he or she is engaged in an activity which is intensely political. Right? Rather, he intervenes in politics in a different way, invoking an ethical horizon that disrupts the political field from the outside. The discursive strategies and actions of new progressive social movements, which I've referred to above, could be seen, I think, as parrhesiastic, if you like, in this sense. They withdraw from the game of power and from formal institutional procedures of politics, instead seeking a transformation of the political space in the name of a greater justice. Sorry, how much time do I have left?
Just 3 or 4 minutes.
3 or 4, okay, fine, okay, good, that's fine, thank you. Okay, so finally, parrhesia on Foucault's reading involves an ethical and political subjectivation in which the individual, in taking the risk of speaking truth freely and in opposition to power, commits him or herself to this truth, right? And this, once again, is strikingly different from today's post-truth populist and the populist paradigm of post-truth, which is a condition characterized by the absolute lack of integrity by what might be called careless speech. Careless speech, not careful speech, but careless speech. Not only does the populist not care about the veracity or truth of what he or she says, he plays fast and loose with the truth, doesn't he? He spreads disinformation and conspiracy theories. But in saying what he says, he takes no personal risks, right? Because he's usually protected by powerful constituencies, right? Despite, their constant claims to victimization, populists are protected by large political constituencies. So in contrast, parrhesia might be considered to be a form of careful speech, not only in its commitment to truth, for which one is prepared to stake one's life, but also in its concern for the integrity of the self. Okay, I'm just coming to the conclusion now. So my claim has been that the renewal of the public sphere in the face of the challenge that faces from post-truth populist discourse lies not only in the defence of existing institutions and norms of liberal democracy, which are obviously very important, but also, I would say, in the invention of new forms of political subjectivity. For Arendt, going back to Hannah Arendt, for Arendt, the importance of institutions such as universities, and she also talked about the judiciary as what she calls refuges of truth. She argues that despite their importance, that the weakness of factual truth is that it's on the side of the status quo, which is why it's so easy to be attacked by populists who are associated with what they call the establishment. Lying, by contrast, or in our terms post-truth, has the advantage here because, according to Arendt, lying is on the side of action and seeks to transform the political situation or to create an alternative reality. This is why lies are always more seductive and exciting than facts, right? Facts, she says, are boring, right? So, like if things like fact-checking worked, or simply providing scientific evidence, we wouldn't have this post-truth problem, but obviously it doesn't, right? Facts don't really stand for themselves, as Hannah Arendt says. So perhaps then, for truth to become effective in the field of politics, it must be associated with movement and transformation. It must be, as it were, on the side of freedom. In gathering in public, in experimenting with alternative discourses and modes of interaction, in transforming the terms of the public sphere, the new progressive social movements that we see emerging all around us today give us some hope that truth is still possible in the world of politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Profesör Newman'a çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Foucault'un parrhesia kavramı üzerinden yola çıktığı hakikati söylemenin artık siyasal direniş biçimi haline geldiğini söyledi. Thank you for your speech. Sıradaki konuşmacımız şimdi bize Martin de Waal, kamusal alanların tasarımını kamusal değerler perspektifinden yeniden sahiplenmeyi amaçlayan deneyimlerini bizimle paylaşacak. Zannederim bir ezan vaktine de yaklaşıyoruz aslında. Maybe we can wait a little because there is right the time is ezan. Okey. Ezan okunacak. Birazdan yaklaşık 1-2 dakika içinde. Eğer beklemek isterseniz bekleyebilirsiniz. Belki ses birazcık sizi bölebilir, rahatsız edebilir ya da isterseniz başlayabilirsiniz. İzleyicilerimiz ve sizin için okeyse eğer başlayabilirsiniz.
Okay. What's the problem?
The ezan from the mosque, the voice little bit maybe interrupt us. That's why I want to ask you. You can start before the ezan, or we can check. Please.
Is the problem here, or is it with online
because
audience?
Of the voice, because of the voice from the mosque. It's
okay. And that's going to be
maybe you
in...
want to wait. It depends on you.
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt you during the ezan. That's why I just want to ask you.
Yeah.
You want to wait?
Yeah, sure. I mean, no,
Okay.
well... what?
28'deydi değil mi ezan vakti? O zaman çok azıcık bekleyelim konuşmamız sırasında bölünmesin diye. İsterseniz minik bir içecek alın. Birazdan devam edelim. Ezan okunduktan sonra konuşmamızı bölmeyelim istedik. Birazcık ses yüksek gelebiliyor çünkü. Anlayışınıza sığınarak 1-2 dakika. gecikmeli de olsa başlayabiliriz. Sesimin ulaştığı yerdeki herkes içeri gelebilirse eğer, sabırsızlıkla beklediğimiz bir diğer konuşmacımız sunumunu yapmak için hazır. Biz de onlara kahve ikram ettik, Türk kahvesi ikram ettik bu arada. Şimdi Profesör Martin de Wol bizimle birlikte olacak. Ara vermeden önce, zorunlu bir ara vermeden hemen önce diyordum ki, kamusal alanların tasarımı, kamusal değerler perspektifinden yeniden sahiplenmeyi amaçlayan deneyimlerini paylaşacak bizimle. If you are ready, we
Sure.
are ready. Professor de Wol.
I'm going to just stand here, yeah. So, yeah, maybe if you want to...
Maybe you can
Yeah.
move here, it's going to be better. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Okay, well, thanks for your patience and great to be here. My name is Martijn de Waal from Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. What I want to do in my 25 or 30 minutes or so is take a step back from the theme of this session and sort of connect what we do at our research group with the theme of all the sessions today, and then slightly sort of turn back to the post-truth theme. Because when I was invited and I was reading the statement for this conference on the website, I was immediately triggered because the goal of this conference is almost one-on-one the same of the goal that we have with our research group, where you say we're looking for new frameworks, we want to move beyond diagnosing crisis, but we want to come up with sort of solutions and see how we can move forward. And that's also what we do at our research group called Civic Interaction Design. So what I want to do is take some of the themes that we've been talking about today, commoning, public sphere, truth, collective action, and look at what can design actually bring to the table. How can design contribute to some of these themes? And that's what we do in our research group. And I brought 3 case studies that I want to share with you. Let's see if we have time to go to all 3 of them. Maybe I'll skip one, we'll see. But before that, I just want to give you some insight on how we think about civic design. And our starting point is this notion from a book from Gordon and Mugar from 2020, where they're defining civic design as the creation of opportunities to interact, form alliances, generate shared interest, and care for matters of public concern, right? And I think that's what we as designers try to do, sort of create those opportunities. And if you look at that, there are 3 aspects for us that are really important, and I'll bring those out before I go into the case studies. The first one is this idea of civics itself as a sphere of collective action towards communal well-being. And for us, the word collective is important, right? It's about bringing people together in publics or in public space or in other kinds of spaces. It is also about this idea of communal well-being, right? That should be the goal of, those bringing together. And then the question, of course, for us as designers is, how do we do that, right? How do we bring people together? And how, once they are together, how do we give them also the agency, to act, to do something, to change something, to get together. And to do that, we're looking at it from 2 different directions. The first one is what we call dramaturgy. And dramaturgy, we look at it at a lens from, you could say, maybe theater, sort of this idea of staging actual experiences or environments in which those people can come together, maybe create a focal point around which they can have a conversation or an experience that they can sort of connect together. A more formal definition I put on the screen behind me, the design of spatial and temporal settings. So events that have a particular duration in time, but there's also roles, like in the theater, and relations through which the interaction between people and or between citizens and institutions can emerge. So that's very important. We always look at it from a sort of a dramatic perspective. How can we design those environments? And the other one is the question, of course, but then who does that, right? Who brings together those publics? And for that, we also often use this notion of curation. In the Netherlands, this term urban curators has emerged. I will talk a little bit about that more. But what we're seeing, that there is an important role and they're often professionals. In the Netherlands, they are often designers or architects or sometimes social workers or artists. And they somehow see an opportunity somewhere in society to change something, and they are the ones who sort of start the staging, form a coalition, bring people in, and try to provide them with all kinds of perspectives to actually change something in society. If you take a look at this picture, this is a bit of, I think, a nice example. Maybe what I mean, it's an installation by an artist collective from Canada called Moment Factory. And this is, their installation is called Megaphone. I don't know if you can really see it, but here's a group of people standing. There is a little stage there, and there is a megaphone standing here on a little stage. This is a project from 10, 15 years ago, and you could sort of shout something into the megaphone, and then there was voice recognition systems, which was very novel at that time, and then some of the keywords would sort of emerge up there, right? So it's sort of a very condensed version, I guess, of, on the one way, sort of an Habermasian public sphere, right? Sort of giving people a stage and a voice so they could speak up. But it also departs a bit from the Habermasian in that it's not just about sort of the rational arguments, they also bring sort of more affective dimensions, right? It's really also about having fun and being there together and sort of the visceral experience of seeing your words on that screen, right? That's also part of that. Now, this is of course a very sort of fugitive moment, something that lasts one evening or maybe there are 3 evenings. We're also looking into the staging of these kinds of events, of processes that may last for years, right? And that have sort of more lasting impact. I mean, this works very well in the sense of public space, of you get people together, they interact briefly with them. It's sort of the beginning of maybe getting a sense of connection, getting a sense of trust. But of course, it doesn't do really much in sort of more long-term change. So for that, we also have other projects. And I brought 3. And the first one that I want to share with you is a project that we've called the Hackable City. And for this, I'm taking you to a neighborhood in the northern part of Amsterdam. It's called Buiksloterham. This is what it looks like from the air. It is a neighborhood that we have in many cities across the industrialized world. The former industrial areas, shipbuilding, but those activities are not being there anymore. It's being, it has to be reinvented. People were starting to build houses, living, working, etc. So it's a bit of a brownfield transformation and regeneration site. And once we got in here, this was a very special moment in time that opened up a lot of opportunities, because at that moment, that was 2010, sort of about 10, 15 years ago, there was this big master plan for this area. And the government had all these ideas. There were private developers who said, okay, we have all these ideas. We're going to build these kind of huge buildings. I mean, they almost look like they could be are from Dubai or some places like that. Although, at the same time, they also had the ambition to develop that area from a point of view of the circular economy, right? So in all the tenders, there was sort of a high demand for, okay, you have to really make sure that these buildings do not use more energy than they can produce, etc., etc. But then, of course, the financial crisis happened, and all these plans fell through, and the question was, okay, what's going to happen with that area then? And that was a moment in time when the government said, okay, if we cannot do it, if the market cannot do it, let's maybe give it back to civil society. Like, let's see if there are bottom-up collectives or groups of people who want to come in and develop that piece of land or that area, but still only if they promise that they can do it from a perspective of circular economy, inventing with sort of new maybe technologies, new ways of living together there, which are based on this communal well-being. And then a group of, actually a number of groups emerged that stepped up. Many of them led by architects, which is of course apparent because it's about the redevelopment. But they really managed to sort of organize groups of citizens around them to collectively develop that area from this perspective. And they did that through several initiatives. This is an interesting one. It's a little place called De Keuvel, and that became a central spot in that area. You see the little site there. It's an old shipbuilding site. The ground was very polluted, so it was not possible to build on the ground. But then there was a group of architects and entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs and other sort of small social design companies who came up with this idea. They said, okay, if we not can build on the ground itself or in the ground, then maybe we can use some of the old houseboats that we have in Amsterdam, and we can sort of put them on the soil, right? So that they're sort of a bit elevated from the soil. So sort of a kind of a hack to bring in a different kind of building. So they collected all these houseboats. They're actually very cheap because in Amsterdam you pay a lot of money for the place, but the boat itself after a while is more or less worthless. So they got a lot of these boats and they formed this little I guess sort of an office park for their creative industries. But they also created a big cafe and a meeting site right next to that. And that became sort of a central place where lots of people came together. But not only did people sort of come together there, it sort of was becoming a public space, it also attracted a lot of attention from media from all around the world, right? Because here was a group of people led by architects who proposed sort of a new way of developing that area and who were also very much pioneering the circular economy. So that site, having that site there, helped to build a story for that place, and that site became actually bigger than itself in the sense that that story became really important, and that helped then, of course, also attract other people. Something else that they did in that area was, rather than having this one big building or a few of those big buildings, the government said, okay, if we cannot do that, let's cut it up into a lot of small pieces and give those to building collectives, so groups of people who want to develop their own place, and do that together. This is an example of those projects. And then again, the architects were sort of leading co-creation processes with the people who were going to live there in all kinds of sessions like this. And they started to do a lot of knowledge exchange, and they started to form a community to develop those houses together. Third thing they did was also all those people that got involved. Not only did they start to have their activities there, but they also set up a more sort of formal network, and they started to make a manifest and saying, okay, this is all the things that we want to do in this area, and this is what we all commit to. And then they try to involve the more institutional actors, like the government or housing corporations or other actors, saying, okay, this is our ambition. Can you help us to realize that, right? Sort of intermediating between what they wanted, together with the residents future residents that they had assembled, and sort of the institutions. As researchers, we followed that process for a few years to sort of understand what kind of dynamics were emerging there. And then we helped the intermediators, sort of the people who organized that, with the development of some tools for acting together. And if you look at what happens there, I mean, it's about building a new environment. But what's interesting is that actually it looks like this, right? We were all the time we were in meetings, right? Because people getting together, exchanging their visions, coming together, maybe like a mini public sphere in a way, to decide what are the goals for this area, what does that mean to be circular, how can it also be social, etc. How do we turn that into actual building plans, etc. And having all these workshops. But then, of course, they didn't only have those kind of meetings, they also had a lot more celebratory meetings, which are of course important sort of for the communal feeling and getting a sense of togetherness. So every time, like maybe a milestone was delivered, then they would together and do all these kind of things. And there was a third type of meeting, and those were sort of the more formal events, right? They also started to stage events in the more the public stages in the city to really show that they were serious about this way of developing the area, inviting the aldermen, and having people sign all kinds of stuff, right? To sort of again plans made by groups of people, collectives, but how do you sort of make them happen? You need sort of the institutions, right? So that's what it looks like on the ground. And to understand the dynamics, we try to sketch it in a diagram. And we came up with this, and I think it's very recognizable for you because I think, civil society actors have been working like this forever. But what's happening is that we're seeing individuals, sort of the people who are going to live there in the future, people who have some a particular interest in realizing civil economies, etc., or circular economies. They're organizing at this collective level, and then at the collective level, they start organizing themselves, making plans, but they need sort of also to bring in the institutions because a lot of the things that they want to do, they are actually not legal yet. Right? Because if you want to do circularity, you want to do new kinds of energy provision, but there's no laws for that, right? So you cannot do that. It's also a matter of sort of bending the institutions towards what you want to do. And for us, this collective level is really interesting because we also saw that at the level of, from the government perspective, it was not really recognized that this was a level. They said, you have governments and we have bottom-up. And bottom-up is really the people themselves. But at the moment that they started to organize themselves in a collective and maybe have an architect or a designer as sort of their organizer, that person was not recognized as a form of bottom-up society. And while there was a lot of policy of we want to promote bottom-up society, but that had to be individual citizens, not collectives. So there was a bit of a struggle there. But we think, that actually that collective level is very important to make those kind of things happen. We also saw that some new roles started to emerge, that if you want to organize those collectives, and I think you probably recognize yourself in many of those roles, but that it was what was new was that it wasn't people from sort of proper civil society organizations, but now that it were artists and designers and creatives, etc., who were sort of taking some of these roles at them in the middle as they started to call themselves urban curators. So they said, okay, we sort of try to make a plan for this area and get everybody involved. And what they were doing is like they were sort of this bottom arrow is sort of their role of community organizers. So make sure that people were involved, that they felt part of it. But then at the same time, they did co-creation workshops. So it was also their role to gather all those ideas and translate them into an actual design for a house, right? Because that's a professional knowledge, and that most people don't know not how to do that, at least not in the Netherlands. So they also had a role of inventor and integrator and expertise. The right arrow to the top is what I said, this role of lobbyist or data analyst or communicator, sort of trying to convince the governments that, hey, you have these laws, but they're really against the circular economy. You should change them. And the way that they do that is by collecting data and stories, try to make the point that, hey, what we're doing here is actually in the public interest. So that's why you should change, maybe your regulations, etc. And they were also helping actually the government in their role of strategic planners and policies by sometimes writing some of these ideas or giving them actually concrete ideas for how these laws are changing. But at the central level, at the collective level, I think this notion of the dramaturgy or the storytelling or the agenda building is also very important, right? That's where sort of this collective emerges through all these kind of events. And I'm going to give you one example of one of those dramaturgies that we co-designed with some of the people there, and also with the Play the City Foundation from Akim Tan, based in Amsterdam. One of the things we did was we designed like an urban game that could help sort of bring all those people together and help them sort of reimagine what that neighborhood could be as one of the dramaturgies. So we had a big playing board. The playing board is the neighborhood. People were assigned particular roles, so it could be NGO, could be a business owner, could be a future resident, could be the mayor, etc. And then we had a catalog of all kinds of buildings that you could put down there, like houses or a youth hostel or a cinema or a square, etc. And people were given a mission, and they were asked sort of in a number of rounds to build on that site sort of what kind of buildings would you want to put there, and that resulted in something like this. There's different ways that you can play it. You can play it in a more free mode. So you ask to the people who are come, okay, build your ideal city here, or you can play it more goal-based, where you sort of test out particular scenarios, or you give people actual roles, right? It's not, okay, build whatever you want, but some people were maybe the elderman or the project developer who may have different ideas, so sort of conflicts could emerge more easily. The game is you are separated in groups, you build kind of things, and then after a while, you stop the game, and then people are standing around it, and they are asked to sort of explain what they were building and why they had built that and what their ambition behind that was as a way of bringing in the discussion. Some roles were really important in the design of that. The facilitator, of course, sort of somebody who keeps the time and sort of gives out, turns of talking, but also the experts. So if somebody would say, okay, I want to do solar panels here and I want to do this and this, then there would be some experts there who could say, well, that's actually not possible because of this, or there is actually this law that sort of prevents it, etc. Right? Sort of bringing all those people in I mean, I think what I enjoyed about this also is it's also a fun activity, right? And I think that Craig Calhoun also said it this morning, that there is also sort of, there can be also sort of an experience of fun and of being together, right? In staging dramaturgies for civics. And that was really happening. But at the same time, also a lot of exchange happened, right? So this person said, okay, I want to use this building for the roof of this building for solar panels. Somebody else said, well, yeah, but you cannot do that on the current regulations. Somebody else would come in, oh, but I have an idea sort of how we can change it, etc. Right? So this is an example of a dramaturgy that we co-designed with the people from Play the City as part of this bigger process of collaboratively developing an area and bringing people together in that. I have two more examples, but I think I'm going to skip the second one because of the time. So
You have already 10 more minutes.
Sorry?
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Okay. I'll use it for the third. Well, I'll do this example if I have time left, and I'll go back to the other one, because the second one is a bit similar. That one was, of course, a process which was about bringing people together physically, designing those places for togetherness, but also trying to understand sort of the bigger structures and the new roles of different people in that. We also do civic interaction design in domains that are sort of the digital, and here we're sort of verging towards what you were just saying or talking about. Like you, we had elections recently, actually last Wednesday, for the parliament in the Netherlands. As you can imagine, like in many other countries, the internet, social media played an important role in that, but not necessarily in a positive way. I've put together some news items from the Dutch newspaper, and I don't think you can read them, but I will translate them. What you see in the bottom is these kind of images. This is like were circulated by right-wing people, right? As an example, as a motivation to vote against or to be against migration. But it's generated by artificial intelligence, right? So in a sense, it's completely fake. But I guess for those people, I mean, it's sort of an effective truth, right? To use a term, it's for those people, it feels that it could be true, but of course it's not. And those kind of images have a very important, can have a very important impact of that. And there was a bit of a scandal because it turned out that these images, they were actually produced by 2 members of parliament of one of the right-wing parties. So rather than doing their work as representatives, they were up in their attics and they were sort of using Gen AI to circulate all these kind of images. But not only these kind of images, also violent images of this is the main leader of the opposition in the Netherlands. And there were also a lot of violent images in which he was beaten up or which he was arrested or shot down. And they were made by members from the parliament, right, in the Netherlands. So that's pretty bad. And then actually, people said to TikTok that, well, you should take those images down. They were reported, but they just didn't do that, right? They were just not interested in responding to those claims. And even there was a session in Parliament about the role of social media in the public sphere, and all the parties, Meta, TikTok, etc., they just didn't show up. They said, oh, we don't have time for this, right? Which shows, I mean, I think this comes back to what Jose was talking about before the break, right? That we've left the public domain, the internet, we really left it to the logic of capitalist, or how did he call it, intensive capitalism, right? The logic for TikTok of making money out of all these controversies was so important, and nobody, not even Parliament, could do anything about it. They just didn't care, you know. And for me, that is amazing, right? That we just left this space that is so important, and we just say, oh yeah, let's just leave it to the big tech moguls. Let's not do anything. Let's not do anything about it. So we've been involved in a number of initiatives in the Netherlands in sort of trying to develop alternatives for that, and not so much alternatives for Facebook or TikTok, but really trying to see, okay, how is it that we can take control back of that public sphere? And the way or the approach that we are taking is that we are thinking that, again, civil society organizations or some institutions should take responsibility for that sphere, right? We shouldn't leave it up to big tech, but I don't know, libraries, public broadcasters, NGOs, they can maybe sort of start creating their own spaces in which they do take responsibility about what kind of images are circulated, what kind of comments are circulated, etc. Right? And there are a number of initiatives. For that, we work together with an initiative in the Netherlands from University of Nijmegen called PubHubs. They're actually developing such. So it's not really social media; it's more groupware, right? Sort of it's alternative spaces where groups of people again can come together. And those groups of people usually have some sort of a common purpose. But now they're more or less, have to go to Facebook because they're not really open source alternatives on which they have sovereignty about the way that the algorithms work, or etc. So they are trying to build that, but they really come from a tech perspective. So they just build it. And what we did with our group was trying to bring in a more designerly perspective, right? Sort of not so much here as a platform, now you can use it, but who are those groups, who are those organizations out there, what are their needs, how can we shape those networks? But it's not just about creating the digital technology itself, it's also about the design of sort of the social protocols or maybe new roles in the organizations for people that can act as a curator or a moderator and make sure that it's, again, not just technology that's being thrown out in society, but that's becoming part of a bigger society with all kinds of rules, regulations, protocols, etc. So yeah, these are some of the examples of the co-creation workshops that we were showing, and we came up with this definition of thing that we were working on. We call it civic social media, digital platforms where members of the community can communicate and collaborate and share information in a safe and trusted way. We did lots of workshops, so this is a bit of the summary of what people felt, what was really important in the design of these alternative spaces. So this safe and trusted way, the platforms that are developed responsibly, so no dark patterns, based on public values, and they are managed in a sovereign manner, so the people who use it can also decide about the logics about them. So we came up with a number of core values, right, that are sort of the base of the design. We also did an inventarization of different types of communities because the people who started to design that software really had this one-size-fits-all. But from our research, of course, the different communities have different needs. So communities of care, for instance, they could be patient organizations. One of the groups that we were working with is a network of 13 patient organizations in the mental health sphere, and they say, we really lack online spaces where people can go to for peer support, right? Sort of, or not only people who have mental problems themselves, but also their family members or their friends, etc. There's really no such a thing. Now they have to go to Facebook, but you don't want to, broadcast on Facebook that you have a mental problem, right? Sort of, you need your own space that is really trusted. So we've called those communities of care. Communities of debate are places, more sort of the Habermasian places, where really different perspectives can come together and maybe some information can be found. You can imagine that all of them have sort of very different requirements in terms of design, right? If you are designing this community of care, then of course privacy is very important, right? It's very important that that you can maybe hide behind a pseudonym or something like that, because you don't want the whole world to read about the mental problem that you're sharing with somebody else. If it's a community of debate, then that's maybe not so. Maybe it's actually better if we sort of make visible who's making a particular point of view, right? So. We don't have time, of course, to go into all of that, but I can tell you more about that. From all that, we came up with a number of design dimensions that you can take into account when you develop those platforms. Like visibility, for instance, is to what extent is my identity visible on a platform like that? Is it my real name? Is it a pseudonym? Is it sort of completely anonymous, etc., etc.? And what I said, we also came up with a bigger roadmap where we say, okay, if we really want to do this, then it's not just about the technological application, but it really also is about the organizational level, right? Sort of organizations taking responsibility for the digital domain in the public sphere. And I guess below that are sort of even more fundamental layers, like maybe an open source technological infrastructure, and of course maybe also policy and legislation. And at the bottom level is sort of a more a more grounded idea of what the values are that such system should be based on. So 2 examples, well 3, but I gave you 2. And I think, what I wanted to share with you was, of course, what happens if we bring design to some of these topics? What do we run into? How do we address that? But most of all, I think, these are some interesting starting points for us when we think about design and civic space. And of course, I've addressed them already a few times. This recognition of these collectives between the individual and the institutions. The situatedness of them. I mean, like I said before, the examples that I'm given here are from the Netherlands. We've been working with those people for a long time. And I don't claim that we have some universal insights or truth from them, but we have some insights that are based on what we address there locally, right? And hopefully some of that can be inspiring for you. And then, of course, there's the role of design, right? I say this playfulness, this affective dimension is important for us. This notion of dramaturgy, of really sort of, designing an experience that is, a trusted and safe civic space of encounter, trust building, negotiation, peer support, etc. And the last one is this emerging role of citizen professional or civic organizations as curators, facilitators, and intermediaries in all that. And also there we see that, those roles are sort of emerging, and we're sort of slowly starting to better understand what it takes to do all that. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was an inspiring speech. Thank you so much. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz ve müştereklerle hakikati de çok güzel bir yerde sentezlediğini düşünüyorum. Kendi alanlarımıza sahip çıkmak noktasında da çok önemli. Yalnız hissetmeyip bunu çoğaltmamız gerekiyor. Profesöre çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Soru cevap kısmına geçeceğim. Eminim değerli profesörlerimize sorularınız vardır. Mikrofon gezdirilecek. Bu arada Ledra Palas'taki oturuma devam edecek olanlar 3.20'de buradan trenimizle hareket edebilirler. Onun da duyurusunu yapmış olayım size. Bugün bir tren gezisi, tren yolculuğu da Ledra Palas'a gidecek olanlar için ayrılmış bulunuyor. Soru yok mu gerçekten? Buraya bir mikrofon iletebilir miyiz? Teşekkürler. Kime olduğunu da söylerseniz. Ayağı rica edebilir miyim? Yayında görünmüyorsunuz ve görünmenizi istiyoruz.
Türkçe mi sorayım, İngilizce mi?
Hiç fark etmez. Hangi dilde konuşmak isterseniz.
Okay, then I want to be frank, so I will speak in English.
Yes, sure. Yes, sure.
It may be kind of a reflection. I don't want to steal a role. I'm from Turkey, by the way. Murat, a difficult and constrained environment. Both examples will be from Turkey. A few weeks ago, I was in Hatay. There was a huge earthquake in 2023. The old city was devastated, and it's like a construction site. This one is related with the public space planning. I was trying to facilitate a consultation meeting and everyone was complaining about that our houses are taken by the government for a construction, and we learn it with a text message to our phones. And a few minutes later, they have received another WhatsApp message, and they left the room with excuses because the government was cutting olive trees, so they must participate to kind of a public protest to protect the olive trees. So I'm not sure if that WhatsApp message was a, what's the term, civic social media. But I'm trying to climb another point. In this kind of constrained environments or shrinking environments, is it ways or example to use the methodologies that you have mentioned? Because I have tried to be inspired. How can I use these methodologies? But not sure. Perhaps we are living in another world. That may be the case. But if you can inspire me on that issue, that would be helpful. And about the truth issue, I will give with excuses, I will give another example. 3 months ago, a youth activist called Enes made a speech in hemicycle in the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, criticized the government. He was very frank and fearless. When he turned back to Turkey, they took him from the airport. He was in jail for 3 months. He slept in the floor. He was still frank and fearless when he left the jail. But another problem is you mentioned that there must be institutions to protect this frank and fearless speech. But the populists in all over the world, not only in Turkey, started to with undermining these institutions. They started with public institutions, then go to universities, then started, they are trying to undermine civil society organizations. In Turkey, our government also gives some lands to civil society organizations, but they are mainly gongos, or maybe family-oriented NGOs, to be honest. This is another world I'm trying to mean, to be clear. It's a very... They are choking us, they are trying to, it's a very constrained environment, but it is very difficult for us to be very frank and fearless or use some innovative methodologies. So this was kind of a reflection, but I'm a little bit frustrated, to be honest. But if you have comments, it would be helpful for me. I know those are not questions, but I must say all of these.
Thank you so much. You want to say something on it? I don't know. Çalışıyor mu? Yeah, you can talk right now. Yep, it's working. Yep.
Well, it was more of a comment, really, wasn't it? That you saying you weren't very impressed with the idea of Pahizio. You thought it's unrealistic in the current context. Did I understand you correctly? Yes. Okay. I mean, of course. I mean, the whole point about Pahizio is it always comes with personal risks. This is why I have nothing but admiration for activists who speak out and who do incur these risks. I think, according to Foucault, this is precisely what gives Pahizio its ethical dimension. How can we not be moved by these examples? And I think this also applies to social movements as well. But of course, we do need institutional protection. We do need, democratic safeguards as well. But often people still speak out in situations where these safeguards are lacking, and I think we have to pay homage to people who do have the courage to speak truth to power. Maybe that sounds a bit naive, maybe that sounds a bit idealistic, but I'm a political theorist.
Thank you so much. You already have your hand.
Thank you for your comments, and I hear you. I completely understand what you're saying. Like I said, the examples that I'm bringing are situated from the Netherlands, and I recognize what you're saying, and we're trying to do there within sort of our realm. I mean, is civic social media going to solve the problem of TikTok? Probably not, right? Because those powers are huge. But this is what we can do at the moment, right? And we hope that this can be a base for further coalition forming, legal action, etc. But that will be a long way, and it won't solve anything in sort of the here and the now and the short notice, and especially not in situations that are far more complex even than the Netherlands.
Thank you. Any question? Başka sorusu olan?
Thank you for both of you for the inspirational speeches. I want to touch on the topics about the AI and AGI. Now we are in the era that we are talking about AI and AGI, and how are you interpreting the concept of truth and post-truth? How they are going to affect actually our understanding of truth and post-truth eras, basically, because now we can say that the database, some information can be counted as truth in general from the public, and from the civic spaces. So how can we interpret and how can we work against this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. To whom?
To both, if it's okay.
Okay.
So it's funny, a bit difficult to hear, but if I understood you correctly, you're talking about how do we deal with the post-truth problem in the era of AI? Is that correct? Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously AI is a game changer, isn't it? It's just simply, accelerates, the dynamics of post-truth. I don't really. I mean, obviously it's going to involve, certain levels of, government regulation, but it might be too late for that. Maybe the cat's already out of the bag. We've opened up sort of Pandora's box with AI. And obviously, political communication is going to become even more distorted, isn't it? With, sort of deep fakes and I just think it's almost like sort of the ultimate sort of extreme of sort of post-truth discourse, actually, isn't it? And it poses really intractable, very, very difficult problems for kind of democratic debate and dialogue. But it's also why I kind of emphasize the importance of actual face-to-face interactions and kind of gathering in public spaces and reinventing the public sphere as also an actual physical spaces, apart from sort of, or aside from kind of online digital spaces. I think maybe this kind of emphasizes the ever-increasing importance of face-to-face physical interactions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, for me, it's totally unimaginable why we've left this space completely open, and we have, for everything in society, we have very complex regulation, and you have to do so many safety tests and product tests and figuring out what the impact could be on somebody's house if you want to bring a product to the market. And the digital space we've left completely open, right? There is, and the people who are running it, like I said in my talk, they're completely unaccountable. And I think that's the problem, right? I do think it's better regulation, but not only regulation, but also actual enforcement of it.
Thank you. Katılımınız için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Burada noktalıyoruz. Treni bir kez daha anons edeyim. 15.20'de buradan kalkacak LEDRA'ya devam edenler için. Paralel oturumlarla devam edeceğiz. Attend ettiğiniz workshoplara buradan gidebilirsiniz. Değerli konuşmacılarımıza da çok teşekkür ediyorum. Thank you professors. Thank you so much. Size de çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Paralel oturumlar ve yarın buluşuyoruz. Görüşmek üzere.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you to our listeners, and thank you to Nazar for moderating this session. We really appreciate it. So for the rest of the day, you'll be at your workshops at 3:20. As Nazar said, the train is leaving just outside near the Bandabulya to go to Ledra Palace. Everybody else, we encourage you to go straight to your workshops now because they will start in 20 minutes. You can have your coffee break there. For those of you who will be at the MIGS workshop, you can have your coffee break here. Please bring your name tags and your booklets with you tomorrow, and we'll see you all here at 9 o'clock. Thank you for being with us today.